I am Evelina, 77, and the ritual of the annual birthday invitation was my last fragile thread to the life I had built and subsequently lost. The life populated by Marcus, Claire, and Julian, my 3 adult children. For decades, the invitations had been a testament to my belief in the enduring gravitational pull of family. I designed them myself. Heavy cream cardstock, embossed silver lettering, carefully chosen poems about autumn harvests and enduring light. I addressed them with a fountain pen, my hand still surprisingly steady. This year, the ritual felt more desperate, a last fervent prayer against the creeping, inevitable cold of estrangement. I had posted them 10 days ago, meticulously affixing the stamps, hearing the satisfying thud as they dropped into the blue mailbox on the corner. And now, the silence. Not a single RSVP, not a text message, not a curt email. Just the deep, constant hum of the refrigerator and the lonely ticking of the grandfather clock Arthur left behind. I tried to pretend it didn't hurt. I told myself that they were busy. Marcus, my eldest, a lawyer in Chicago, was always consumed by his practice. Claire, the artist, lived a beautifully chaotic life across the country. And Julian, my youngest, the quiet academic, was perpetually buried in his research. They were successful, independent, and busy. And perhaps too busy to remember the small, necessary gestures that keep a mother's heart from collapsing into dust. I walked through the house, dusting the surfaces I had already dusted, adjusting the picture frames I had already adjusted. The house was immaculate, a shrine to order and control, perhaps because everything else in my life felt increasingly anarchic and outside my grasp. In the living room, a photo of the 3 of them, sun-kissed, gap-toothed, laughing on a childhood beach, stared back at me. I remembered the fierce, physical ache of loving them then, the overwhelming responsibility of being their foundation. Had I loved them too fiercely? Had I become too much? When does a mother's fierce, foundational love transition in her children's eyes from a comforting anchor to a heavy, inhibiting weight? I prepared a small, insignificant dinner, a slice of toast, half an avocado. The act of cooking for one felt like a constant, quiet surrender. I would sit at the large mahogany dining table, the table that once seated 10, and feel the echoing absence of every argument, every feast, every shared silence. The fear was always there, a low-frequency hum just beneath the surface of my consciousness. The fear of becoming truly, completely irrelevant. I didn't fear death. I feared the slow, solitary dissolution of my life until it no longer registered on anyone's emotional map. The postman, Mr. Jenkins, was a kind, ruddy-faced man who always paused to chat. On the 11th day, he handed me the usual junk mail, a catalog, and a thick, familiar envelope. I took the mail into the kitchen. I sifted through the junk, and then my fingers brushed against the heavy cream cardstock. My heart, a weary, unreliable organ, gave a sudden, painful lurch. It was one of my invitations. Returned to sender. The envelope was sealed, the silver lettering untouched, the pristine white label stark against the cream. Returned to sender. Address unknown. The blood drained from my face. I stumbled, gripping the kitchen counter for support. This was worse than silence. Silence implied busyness, a temporary oversight. This was a physical rejection, a document confirming my profound distance from one of my own children. I recognized the hand addressing immediately. Julian's address, my quiet, bookish, youngest son. I carefully, meticulously slit the envelope open. Inside, the formal invitation stared back at me. I checked the back of the envelope. The post office stamp was clear. return to sender. And then the new label, affixed by the postal worker. Moved, left no forwarding address. He had moved. Julian. My quiet, introspective academic, the one I spoke to only once a month, had picked up his entire life and relocated without a single word to his mother. Not a note, not a call, not an email update. Nothing. The initial shock gave way to a cold, crystalline fury. This wasn't negligence. This was an active decision to sever. He had consciously chosen to make his life untraceable to me. I gripped the returned invitation until the edges cut into my palm. The physical pain was a relief, a grounding anchor in the dizzying chaos of the emotional blow. I walked to the phone, my hand hovering over his old number. I wanted to scream, to demand an answer, to unleash the torrent of 77 years of suppressed maternal frustration. But then, the chilling clarity returned. He had already answered. The sealed envelope was the answer. What good would a frantic, tearful call do, except to confirm my worst fear, that I was an overbearing nuisance he had actively escaped? I put the invitation in my desk drawer, beneath the utility bills. I did not mention it to Marcus or Claire. The silence between them felt too fragile to puncture with the brutal truth of Julian's escape. Does the deepest hurt come not from those who openly argue with you, but from those who simply choose to erase you from their map? The subsequent week was an exercise in pure, sustained grief. I moved through the house with the heavy steps of a pallbearer, conducting the funeral of my hope. I realized I was doing exactly what I had feared most. Waiting. Waiting for a phone call. Waiting for a letter. Waiting for any sign that I still registered as a living entity in their world. The waiting became unbearable. The weight of the hours stretched until they felt endless. I had to leave the house. I had to interrupt the suffocating silence. I remembered the community center near the library, a large brick building I had always driven past, associating it vaguely with shuffleboard and bingo. The senior community hub. It seemed like a desperate, final resort, the place where the irrelevant gathered to confirm their shared status. I drove there on a Tuesday afternoon, pulling into the parking lot with a shameful reluctance. The building smelled of fresh coffee and institutional cleaning products. I signed in with a polite but harried volunteer. "Welcome, dear. What brings you in today? We have Tai Chi at 2, or you can join the knitting group." I just need to be where there are other people," I confessed, the words tasting like ash. I wandered into a large, sun-filled room where several tables were set up. At one table, 4 people were playing cards with an intense, quiet focus. At another, 3 women were engaged in a low-voiced, serious conversation. I hesitated, feeling the awkwardness of an outsider, the social paralysis that came from years of being defined solely by my family roles. I chose a chair near the window, pretending to read a brochure. I focused on the way the light fell on the floorboards, anything to avoid making eye contact. "Are you new here?" The voice was direct, gravelly, and entirely without pity or false cheer. I looked up. A woman was standing over me. She had a thick braid of silver hair, worn jeans, and eyes the color of sea glass. Eyes that seemed to see right through my carefully constructed facade of polite widowhood. "Yes," I managed. "I'm Evelina." "I'm Marjorie," she said, pulling up a chair without waiting for an invitation. "And that one," she nodded towards a delicate-looking woman with perfectly coiffed blonde hair, "is Sylvie. We're the misfits. We meet once a week for dinner because our children prefer their own noise to our company." Marjorie's brutal, refreshing honesty was a shock. It was the first time in months someone had named my hidden wound without demanding I cover it up. Sylvie glided over, her movements fluid and elegant. Marjorie is dramatic, dear, but she's right. It's the club of the quietly exiled. What's your story? I felt the sudden, hot sting of tears, not from sadness, but from relief. I couldn't tell them about Julian's returned invitation. Not yet. My story, I managed, taking a deep breath, is that I sent out 3 invitations to my birthday, and nobody answered. I just needed to be where I didn't have to listen to the silence. Marjorie nodded slowly, her sea-glass eyes softening, but not with pity, with recognition. "Welcome, Evelina," she said, leaning in. "Silence is a choice. We choose to make our own noise. Now tell me, do you prefer red wine or white? We're discussing Tuesday dinner." I joined them. Marjorie, the pragmatic realist, who had been estranged from her daughter for years after a bitter financial dispute. Sylvie, the elegant survivor, whose son treated her like a quaint antique to be occasionally displayed, but never truly consulted. And then there was Arthur. Not my Arthur, but a quiet, imposing man of my age, sitting alone at the card table, his hands steady, his face a landscape of contained sorrow. Marjorie introduced us the next day. "This is Robert. He comes here to escape the smothering attention of his daughter, who thinks his only purpose is to watch her grandchildren every Tuesday and Thursday." Robert looked up, his eyes a warm, surprising hazel. "I come here to remember what it's like to be treated like an adult with my own calendar, Evelina. Pleasure to meet you." The 4 of us formed the core of the dinner group. We met every Tuesday evening at my house, the grand, silent mahogany table finally hosting laughter and real, messy conversation again. We didn't solve each other's problems, but we witnessed each other's reality. My house filled with the smells of Marjorie's hearty, slightly chaotic stews, Sylvie's exquisite, delicate pastries, and the faint, grounding scent of Robert's pipe tobacco. We talked about politics, gardening, the absurdity of aging, and the quiet, aching paradox of loving children who no longer needed us. I found a fierce, quiet joy in setting the table for 4, in the deliberate act of preparing a feast, not out of obligation, but out of desire. One evening, over a bottle of slightly too dry Merlot, I finally told them the whole story. The heavy cardstock, the stamps, the returned envelope, the brutal confirmation of Julian's escape. Marjorie simply reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Her touch was rough, warm, and entirely accepting. "He chose the silence of evasion over the difficulty of honesty, Evelina," she said, her voice gentle. "That is his failure, not yours. Your job now is to choose noise." Robert, quiet as always, simply cleared his throat. "I've moved twice in the last year without telling my daughter the new address. Sometimes, the only peace you can purchase is the sudden removal of yourself from their expectations." His confession was a shock, a sudden, deep well of understanding. Julian's act, which had felt like a singular, devastating rejection, was, in Robert's context, an act of self-preservation. Is the final, most necessary act of a long life the quiet, profound permission to put your own emotional needs first? I looked at the 3 of them, the misfits, the quietly exiled, the founders of the new resistance. We were not replacements for the family we had lost. We were something infinitely better, the family we had actively chosen. My phone, sitting silent on the kitchen counter, no longer held power over me. I wasn't waiting. I was planning the menu for next Tuesday, and I was alive, moving forward, surrounded by the beautiful, messy, undeniable noise of my own making. The darkness had not disappeared, but I had found the small, steady light to navigate by. The story of Evelina had stopped being a tragedy of waiting and started becoming an adventure of daring. The arrival of the new year brought snow to my quiet neighborhood and a profound, settled peace to my heart. The four of us, Marjorie, Sylvie, Robert, and I, had evolved from an emergency support group into a true, functional unit. Our Tuesdays became the immovable center of my week, a sanctuary where my identity as Evelina was primary, and my past role as mother was merely a biographical footnote. We had developed the easy, comfortable language of old friends, a language built on knowing where to push and where to simply listen. We were not therapists for each other, but cartographers, helping map the emotional landmines left by our original families. Marjorie's stews grew bolder, Sylvie's pastries more intricate, and Robert's silences more expressive. He and I found a shared quiet space in the evenings, often sitting by the fire while the others finished the dishes, discussing books and the specific, dark humor required to survive a Colorado winter. One evening, Robert looked into the flames, a contemplative expression settling on his face. "The hardest thing about the estrangement," he confessed, his voice low and steady, "is the shame. The world tells you that a loving parent is always rewarded with devotion. When your children choose distance, you feel like a failure, a moral stain." I nodded, gripping my wine glass. The shame of the returned invitation. It felt like a public failure to raise good human beings, as if the post office stamped my entire life with address unknown. Why is a parent's self-worth so inextricably linked to the unpredictable moral choices of their adult children? But the four of us had stripped away that shame. We acknowledged the failure lay not in our love, but in the children's choice to prioritize their comfort over their parents' humanity. In this space, we were simply four adults, navigating the late stage of life with quiet dignity. My original children, Marcus and Claire, continued their distant vigilance. They called only to ask transactional questions about my health insurance, the house maintenance, or my retirement accounts, never about my emotional life or the simple joy of my Tuesday dinners. I answered their questions efficiently, politely, never mentioning Marjorie's sharp wit or Robert's insightful observations. My new life was too precious to expose to their pragmatic scrutiny. The confrontation came, predictably, from a breach of the unspoken treaty. One Sunday, Claire arrived unannounced. She had flown in from California for a conference and had decided to make a quick, efficient appearance. She looked stressed and impeccably dressed, her clothing a clear rejection of the lived-in comfort of my home. She walked into the living room, paused, and her eyes immediately landed on a corner table. There, I had arranged a small, eclectic collection of artifacts from my new life. A framed photograph of the four of us laughing raucously during a disastrous attempt at making bread. A brightly colored, slightly wonky ceramic bowl Marjorie had given me. And a small, antique compass Robert had gifted me. "Mom," Claire began, her voice tight with disapproval. "What is all this? Who are these people?" "They are my friends, Claire," I replied, folding my knitting. "We have dinner every Tuesday." "Dinner? Every Tuesday? Why didn't you tell me? Are they reliable? Are they, vetted?" She gestured vaguely at the artifacts. "That bowl looks like something a student made. Are they taking advantage of you? At your age, people can be very manipulative." Her concern wasn't for my well-being, but for my assets. She feared that some unsavory character from the community center was worming their way into my secure life. They are not manipulative, Claire, I said, rising slowly, ensuring my posture was straight and unyielding. They are simply people who enjoy my company without an agenda. They see me, Claire, not my insurance portfolio. She flushed, recognizing the pointed accusation. That's not fair. We care about you. We just worry when you do things outside of your routine. Who is the man in that picture? That is Robert, I said, picking up the small brass compass he had given me. He is a wonderful conversationalist. He taught me the necessary art of walking away from manufactured drama. I held the compass out to her. This is a gift from him. He gave it to me so I could find my true north. You see, Claire, for decades, I believed my true north was always you three. Now, I know it's simply forward motion, and he understands that perfectly. Claire's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in the profound confusion of a person whose expected territory is suddenly being contested. I just think you need to be careful, she insisted, retreating to her comfort zone of advice. You need to focus on what matters. Your family. I am focusing on my family, Claire, I asserted, placing the compass back on the table. And my family is currently the group that values my presence over my convenience. Now, I understand you have a conference to get back to. Did you want that lasagna from the freezer before you leave? The transaction completed, she left shortly after, her departure a whirlwind of expensive perfume and agitated resentment. I knew the conversation would be repeated to Marcus, the report of the suspicious new friends and the unwise spending of time. But the confrontation had been a quiet, necessary victory. I had not apologized for my happiness. I had not yielded my boundaries. And the intrusion had only served to solidify the profound, vital importance of my Tuesday night table. The joy, however, was not only found in defiance, it was found in the small, deep acts of chosen intimacy. One cold, wet Tuesday, we gathered at my house, the rain drumming against the window panes. After dinner, we always read aloud, a ritual Robert had introduced, reading excerpts from literature that spoke to the complexity of the human condition. That night, Robert brought a worn copy of a book of poetry. He read a poem about solitude, aging, and the quiet dignity of a life lived fully, regardless of external recognition. As he read, his voice low and rich, I looked around the table. Marjorie was nodding, her sea-glass eyes reflecting the firelight. Sylvie was leaning forward, captivated. We were four souls, stripped of our familial titles, listening to the words describe our shared universal condition. When Robert finished, the silence was long and sacred. "That's beautiful, Robert," I whispered. "It speaks to the quiet ache." "The quiet ache," he agreed, closing the book gently. "But also the quiet triumph. We are still here, Evelina. We chose to be here. We chose to read poetry on a Tuesday night instead of waiting for a phone that will not ring." His words settled over me, profound and true. I finally understood the full geometry of our chosen love. It was not a replacement. It was a reconstruction. We were building a new foundation, one piece of honesty, one shared dinner, one piece of poetry at a time. I thought of Julian, wherever he was, living his hidden life. I thought of my returned invitation, still filed away in my desk drawer. It no longer represented a devastating rejection. It represented a closing door, allowing me to finally open the vast, beautiful expanse of my new, self-defined world. I was Evelina, the architect of my own peace. And tonight, I was loved, seen, and utterly, profoundly happy. The slow bloom of affection between Robert and me was not a fiery, reckless thing, but a quiet, sustained warmth, like a well-banked fire on a cold night. It was a love built not on projection and need, but on the foundation of shared lack, the shared experience of being dismissed, and the fierce mutual determination to reclaim our individual worth. Our connection deepened during those Tuesday evenings, extending subtly into shared interests. We began a weekly ritual, Thursday afternoons at the local used bookstore, followed by a shared, precisely brewed cup of tea, Earl Grey for me, black coffee for him. It was during one of these outings, surrounded by the comforting, dusty scent of old paper, that the easy formality between us finally dissolved. I was searching for an obscure volume of Russian poetry. Robert was looking for naval history. "You know, Evelina," Robert said, pulling a book from a high shelf and handing it to me, "you have the most beautiful silence. It's not empty, like the silence I used to endure. It's expectant." His compliment was so specific, so deeply observed, that it disarmed me entirely. My heart gave a strange, unexpected flutter, a sensation I hadn't registered since Arthur and I were courting 60 years ago. Arthur had loved my busyness, my efficiency, the noise I created to manage his life. Robert loved my silence. Is the most profound form of late-life love the recognition and validation of the very parts of you that others failed to see? Our relationship was defined by quiet gestures. He would notice if I was wearing a new scarf. I would bring him an article clipped from the newspaper about maritime history. There were no grand declarations, only the steady, dependable offering of mutual attention. One rainy Saturday, Robert called, not for our usual Thursday rendezvous, but a spontaneous request. "Evelina," his voice rumbled over the line, carrying the low comfort of a distant storm. "I'm going to the Denver Botanical Gardens. The orchids are in bloom. Would you join me?" My breath caught. It was a proper invitation, a date, stripped of the buffer of the group. "Yes, Robert," I replied, a small, involuntary smile touching my lips. "I would love that." The botanical gardens were a triumph of controlled, lush chaos, a series of glass-enclosed biomes that smelled of damp earth and exotic blossoms. Robert and I walked slowly through the warm, humid air of the conservatory, the outside world of winter snow forgotten. The orchids were magnificent, complex, strange, and vibrant. Robert paused in front of a delicate, purple-veined phalaenopsis. "My wife, Clara, she loved these," he murmured, his gaze distant. "She used to fuss over them constantly. When she died, I let them all wither. It seemed easier." I looked at him, seeing the contained sorrow that had defined him for so long. Grief is a tricky gardener. Sometimes it demands absolute clarity. He turned to me, his warm hazel eyes meeting mine with startling directness. "I think you've taught me that grief is also a form of inertia, Evelina. You've introduced a powerful element of forward motion into my life. I haven't been this actively present in decades." I felt a sudden rush of tenderness, a desire to reach out and simply touch his hand, a desire I sternly suppressed. We were both carrying the heavy, specific histories of our former lives, and this new connection demanded patience and reverence for those burdens. "And you, Robert," I said, my voice soft. "You've shown me that the shame I carried from my children's indifference belongs to them, not to me. You made Julian's rejection feel less like a wound and more like an unavoidable fact of geography." We continued walking, the conversation flowing easily between memory and the vibrant reality of the orchids. The intimacy was electric, built on shared truths rather than shared performance. It was a conversation I realized I had never truly had with Arthur, who required constant management and reassurance, never raw, unvarnished honesty. Arthur's love had been a vast, demanding ocean. Robert's felt like a deep, quiet harbor. Is the love you find in the late autumn of life so precious precisely because it is built not on hopeful projection, but on the certainty of mutual knowledge? Later that afternoon, after we had exhausted the gardens and retreated to a quiet cafe, Robert made his move. It was so subtle, so beautifully understated, that I almost missed the momentousness of the gesture. We were talking about the logistics of our dinner group, Marjorie's insistence on a specific type of cheese, Sylvie's allergy to gluten. "I enjoy the Tuesdays, Evelina," Robert said, stirring his coffee. "But I have to confess something. I enjoy the Thursdays more." He looked up, his gaze steady. "I like having a small, separate time with you, a time that is solely about us, with no mitigating factors. Would you allow me to make that a more regular occurrence? Perhaps dinner, just the two of us, on Saturdays? I make a respectable rack of lamb." My heart soared, a sudden, dizzying ascent. He wasn't asking for commitment or a declaration. He was asking for time, the most precious commodity of all. "I would like that very much, Robert," I replied, my voice steady, masking the trembling excitement in my chest. "I accept your invitation. I look forward to sampling your rack of lamb." We left the cafe, the world outside now dusted with a fresh, fine layer of snow. Robert offered me his arm, a steady, strong presence, and I accepted it without hesitation. As we walked back to the car, the snow muffling the sounds of the city, I felt an almost impossible lightness. I was 77, betrayed by my own blood. But I was also walking through the snow, arm in arm with a kind, handsome man who respected my silence and valued my truth. The joy was overwhelming, yet quiet, a deep, resonant certainty. I was not replacing Arthur. I was not seeking a caretaker. I was simply, beautifully, finding the last great love of my life. A love that saw me, Evelina, with absolute clarity. The road ahead was long, and I was no longer walking it alone. My story was not ending. It was deepening, colored now by the warm, surprising hue of shared affection.